A black man has no business raising a white child. I'm denying this adoption." Social worker Patricia Morrison's words cut through the government office like a blade. David Hayes sat frozen in the plastic chair, staring at the white woman across the desk who'd just destroyed his world with the same casual tone someone might use to decline a second cup of coffee. 7-year-old Michael was at school right now, sitting in second grade doing math worksheets, completely unaware his entire future was being decided in this beige-walled office without him present. The kid had drawn a picture last night, stick figures holding hands with "Me and Dad Forever," written in crooked purple crayon, and it was hanging on David's refrigerator right now, held up with a magnet shaped like a Tyrannosaurus Rex because Michael was obsessed with dinosaurs. David's phone buzzed against his hip. Text from Michael's teacher. "He's been asking every 5 minutes when you're coming, excited for the big news." That message felt like a knife twisting because there was no big news. There was only this woman across the desk who'd decided his skin color made him unfit to parent a child who didn't share it. Have you ever been judged so completely that someone destroyed your family based purely on what you looked like? Patricia Morrison barely glanced up from her computer screen, fingers clicking rapidly across the keyboard like she was filling out routine paperwork instead of devastating someone's life. Mid-50s, cardigan sweater, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked like every stereotype of a government bureaucrat who'd stopped caring about the actual humans whose lives she controlled. "Excuse me?" David's voice came out remarkably calm despite the rage building in his chest, like pressure behind a dam about to break. "What did you just say?" "I said I'm denying your adoption petition, Mr. Hayes." Her tone was flat, bureaucratic, final. "After careful review of your case file, I've determined this placement is inappropriate. You're a single black man attempting to adopt a white child. That raises significant concerns about cultural identity, racial socialization, and the child's ability to connect with his heritage." David forced himself to take a slow breath, counting to 5 before responding, because he knew from 36 years of living in this country as a black man, that showing any emotion beyond calm, polite deference would only make things catastrophically worse. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Michael has been living with me for 2 years, 24 months. He calls me Dad. He has his own bedroom decorated with dinosaur posters because he wants to be a paleontologist. He has routine and stability for the first time in his life. He's thriving." David pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase and set it on her desk with a solid thump. His therapist reports significant progress processing his early trauma and building secure attachment. His teacher says he's excelling academically and socially. His pediatrician confirms he's healthy and developing normally. Every professional who's evaluated this placement recommends immediate approval. Patricia didn't even look at the folder. "Mr. Hayes, those professionals focused on current functioning. I'm looking at long-term developmental needs. Michael is a white child who needs to understand his white racial identity. You cannot provide appropriate cultural framework. You cannot teach him about his heritage because it's not your heritage." The words hung in the air like poison gas. "If I were white," David said slowly, "would you deny this adoption?" Her face flushed slightly. "This has nothing to do with your race. Answer the question. Everything else identical, but I'm white. Would you deny it?" "That's a hypothetical that doesn't—" "You're denying this because I'm black and Michael is white. That's racial discrimination. That's illegal under federal adoption law." Patricia stood abruptly, her chair hitting the wall behind her. "How dare you accuse me of racism? I've worked in child welfare for 15 years. I've placed hundreds of children in loving homes. My decision is based on professional judgment and what's truly best for this child." "Then explain why every other professional approved this placement except you," David replied, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "His therapist with 20 years of experience says finalize immediately. His teacher says he's thriving beyond expectations. His doctor says he's the healthiest he's ever been. The home study evaluator gave a glowing report. The guardian ad litem recommended approval. Every single professional except you." "I see what they all somehow missed," Patricia said, crossing her arms. I see a black man trying to adopt a white child, and my responsibility is to advocate for what's truly best, even when that position is unpopular. You see a black man and think he's not good enough for a white child. This meeting is over. Patricia's hands were shaking now as she reached for her phone. My recommendation goes to court this afternoon. You can appeal if you want, but I'm calling security to escort you out. David stood slowly, looking at this woman who'd wielded bureaucratic power like a weapon against his family. And he made a decision. Before I leave, he said quietly, there's something you should know. Something I kept private because I wanted to experience this system the way regular families do. Patricia was already typing on her computer. There's nothing more to discuss. I'm Judge David Hayes, Family Court Division. I've been presiding over adoption cases in this jurisdiction for 8 years. I recused myself from my own case because of obvious conflict of interest. And what I just experienced is the clearest example of racial discrimination I've seen in my entire legal career. The color drained from Patricia's face like someone had pulled a plug. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. What? David pulled out his judicial credentials, the official ID he used to enter the courthouse every day. Gold seal, his photo. Judge David Hayes, Family Court Division. I'm a sitting family court judge, he said calmly. You just told a judge, on the record, that black people are inherently unfit to raise white children. Do you understand what you've done? Patricia started shaking violently. I didn't know. Your file didn't say. My file shouldn't need to say I'm a judge for you to treat me fairly. But you were comfortable denying this adoption when you thought I was powerless. Now you're terrified because you realize I have authority. That tells me everything about your decision-making process. Please, Patricia whispered, sinking back into her chair. I apologize. You didn't mean to discriminate against someone with power to fight back? David interrupted. But what about all the families you've destroyed who didn't have credentials? How many black families have you blocked? How many Hispanic families denied? How many same-sex couples rejected? How many children kept in foster care because the parents didn't meet your prejudiced standards about what families should look like? Please don't report this. Patricia was crying now. 15 years in this field. I have a family, mortgage, kids in college. My career will be destroyed. I'll approve the adoption right now. Just don't file a complaint. You'll approve it because you're scared, David said. Not because you realize you're wrong. That's not professional growth. That's fear of consequences. I was wrong, she sobbed. I see that now. The adoption should be approved. I'll write the most glowing recommendation. Please don't destroy my career. David looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd been so confident, so certain of her authority to judge his fitness as a parent, now reduced to begging. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. You're going to approve this adoption. Today, right now, while I'm sitting here watching you type it, you're going to submit your recommendation stating that this placement serves Michael's best interests and should be finalized immediately. Patricia nodded frantically, fingers flying across her keyboard. Then, David continued, we're going to review your entire case history. Every adoption you've handled over the past 5 years minimum. Every approval, every denial, every recommendation. And if I find patterns of discrimination, and I suspect I will, no amount of apologies will save your career. I understand, Patricia whispered. I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. Please. And if you ever make another decision based on race or any other protected characteristic, David said, leaning forward slightly, I will personally ensure you never work in child welfare again. Not in this state, not in any state. Do we have an understanding? Yes, completely. I understand. David watched as she completed the approval paperwork, her hands shaking so badly she had to retype several sections. When she finally hit submit, he saw the confirmation appear on her screen. Adoption petition approved, recommended for immediate finalization. Email me confirmation by end of business today, David said. And Patricia, every case you've touched is now under review. Every family you've denied will get a second look. Every complaint that was dismissed will be reopened. You wanted to judge families based on appearance? Now someone's going to judge you based on evidence. He walked out of that office, leaving Patricia Morrison sobbing at her desk, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. David made it to his car before his hands started shaking uncontrollably. She was really going to do it, actually going to rip Michael away from him. Destroy 2 years of love and healing and family building, all because of skin color. And if he'd been anyone else, a teacher, an engineer, an accountant, literally anything except a judge with power to fight back, she would have gotten away with it completely. That realization burned through him like acid. Not what almost happened to him. What is happening right now, in offices exactly like that one across this country, to families who don't have judicial credentials or institutional power or resources to fight back effectively. His phone buzzed. Text from his sister who knew about today's meeting. How did it go? Is it approved? David typed back with still shaking hands. Approved. Long story. Picking up Michael now. Thank God. Give that boy the biggest hug from Auntie. David sat in the parking lot for another few minutes, letting his heart rate return to normal, letting the adrenaline drain from his system. Then he drove to Michael's elementary school. The receptionist smiled when she saw him walk through the front doors. Right on time as always, Mr. Hayes. Michael's been watching the clock all morning. That boy has been so excited. David walked down the familiar hallway toward the library where Michael was waiting with his teacher. And there he was, sitting at a small table with his legs swinging because his feet didn't reach the floor, clutching that purple crayon drawing like his life depended on it. The kid saw David, and his face transformed into pure sunshine. Dad, did they say yes? David knelt down to eye level, looking at this blonde-haired, blue-eyed child that a social worker had tried to take from him based solely on skin color. Yeah, buddy, he said softly. They said yes. You're Michael Hayes now, my son, forever. Michael crashed into him with a hug so tight they almost fell over. For real? Really, really, really? Really, really, really. Forever and ever. Michael started crying. Happy, overwhelmed tears streaming down his face. I was so scared they'd say no. I had bad dreams about having to leave, about them making me go somewhere else. David held his son tighter, feeling his own eyes burning. Nobody's making you leave. Nobody can take you away from me. You're mine and I'm yours. That's never changing. Not ever. Even though I'm white and you're black? The question broke David's heart because it meant Michael had been carrying this worry, understanding on some level that their difference in skin color might matter to people who had power over their lives. Especially because you're white and I'm black, David said firmly. Because our family proves that love is bigger than skin color. You are my son in every way that matters. And now it's official. Nothing can change that. Ever. Michael wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Can we get ice cream to celebrate? Buddy, we can get whatever you want. They got ice cream. Chocolate chip cookie dough for Michael, vanilla with hot fudge for David, and sat in the bright shop while Michael chattered excitedly about telling everyone at school tomorrow that the adoption went through, that he was officially Michael Hayes, that he had a forever family. But David's mind was already working through what came next. Patricia Morrison's approval had saved his family, but what about all the other families she'd destroyed over her 15-year career? What about the children still sitting in foster care because she'd decided their loving parents didn't look right? That evening, after Michael was asleep, David made a phone call. Chief Judge Carter, it's David Hayes. I need to talk to you about something that happened today, something serious. Chief Judge Margaret Carter had been David's mentor when he first joined the bench 8 years ago. She listened without interrupting as David described his experience with Patricia Morrison. When he finished, there was a long silence. Jesus Christ, David, Margaret finally said. She actually said those words? That a black man has no business raising a white child? Verbatim. And she only backed down when I revealed I was a judge. If I'd been anyone else, she would have destroyed my family without a second thought. What do you need from me? I need a full investigation into her case history. Every adoption she's handled. Every denial. I want to know how many families she's discriminated against over the years. You'll have it, Margaret said immediately. I'll contact the state, licensing board, and the Attorney General's office first thing tomorrow morning. David, I'm so sorry this happened to you, and I'm grateful you had the power to protect yourself and Michael. But you're right. We need to know how many families didn't have that protection. 6 weeks later, the adoption was finalized in an official court ceremony. David's colleague, Judge Martinez, presided since David obviously couldn't handle his own case. The courtroom was packed with family, friends, Michael's therapist, his teacher, his pediatrician, everyone who'd been part of their journey. Michael wore his best clothes and carried that purple crayon drawing, now carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. When Judge Martinez declared the adoption complete and officially announced that Michael Rodriguez was now legally Michael Hayes, the courtroom erupted in applause that lasted 5 full minutes. Patricia Morrison wasn't there. According to records David later reviewed, she'd submitted her glowing approval exactly 3 hours after he left her office. She'd called in sick the next day. 2 weeks later, she'd submitted her resignation, citing health reasons and family obligations. But David's investigation was just beginning. 3 months later, David returned to the bench after his leave of absence. His first case back was an adoption hearing. A single black woman named Angela Williams, trying to adopt her 6-year-old white foster son named Tyler. The boy had been with her for 18 months. All professional evaluations enthusiastically supported the adoption. The home study was exemplary. The social worker's report recommended denial. David read through the familiar language. Concerns about cultural identity development, questions about racial socialization, suggestions about finding a more appropriate placement. The same coded discrimination he'd experienced personally, dressed up as professional concern. He looked at the social worker standing in his courtroom looking confident and professional. Looked at Angela sitting at the table looking absolutely terrified, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Looked at 6-year-old Tyler holding her hand, looking confused and worried. I've reviewed the social worker's report submitted in this case, David said, his voice carrying full judicial authority across the courtroom. And I find the concerns raised to be without merit and potentially discriminatory in nature. The social worker's confident expression faltered slightly. The child has been successfully placed with Ms. Williams for 18 months, David continued. All professional evaluations from therapists, physicians, teachers, and home study evaluators support this adoption without reservation. The concerns raised about cultural identity appear to be based primarily on racial differences between parent and child rather than any actual evidence of harm or deficiency in the placement. He leaned forward slightly. This court finds such concerns inappropriate and insufficient grounds for denying an adoption that is clearly serving the child's best interests in every measurable way. The social worker's recommendation is overruled. The adoption petition is granted effective immediately. Angela burst into tears, pulling Tyler into a tight hug. The boy looked confused but happy. The social worker looked genuinely shocked that a judge had just publicly overruled her recommendation and called it potentially discriminatory. After the hearing concluded and the courtroom cleared, Angela approached the bench with Tyler still holding her hand. Your Honor, I don't know how to thank you. I honestly thought they were going to take him today. The social worker kept telling me I wasn't the right fit for him, that he needed a family that looked like him. The law is clear that race cannot be the basis for adoption decisions, David said. You're obviously a good mother. Tyler is clearly thriving in your care. That's what matters, not whether you match in skin tone. Can I ask why you ruled the way you did? Angela asked quietly. I've talked to other families in similar situations, and they said most judges just go along with the social worker recommendations. David paused, considering how much to share. Because I've experienced exactly what you just experienced. Not long ago, I know what it's like to have a social worker try to destroy your family based on racial bias disguised as professional concern. Understanding dawned in Angela's eyes. You adopted across racial lines, too. My son is 7, blonde hair, blue eyes, calls me dad and loves dinosaurs and makes me pancakes for breakfast on special occasions. David smiled. A social worker tried to deny our adoption for the exact same reasons yours tried to deny Tyler. She didn't succeed. And I'm going to make damn sure other families don't face that discrimination either. Angela left the courtroom with her son. Legally, permanently, officially her son now. And word began spreading through the family court system. Judge Hayes doesn't tolerate discrimination based on race or family structure. Judge Hayes will overrule social worker recommendations if they're based on bias rather than evidence. Judge Hayes believes families can look different and still be valid. Over the following months, David's reputation grew. Social workers learned that racial matching preferences wouldn't be accepted in his courtroom, that they needed actual evidence of problems, not just discomfort with how families looked. And families who'd been denied by prejudiced social workers started requesting their cases be heard in Judge Hayes's courtroom, knowing they'd get fair evaluation. But protecting families one case at a time wasn't enough. David needed to understand the full scope of Patricia Morrison's damage. The investigation Chief Judge Carter had initiated was thorough and devastating. Working with federal investigators and state licensing authorities, they reviewed Patricia's entire 15-year career in child welfare. The numbers told a horrifying story. Over 15 years, Patricia had handled 847 adoption cases. She'd recommended denial in 203 cases, nearly a quarter of all cases she touched. When investigators broke down those denials by demographics, the pattern was unmistakable. 87% of her denials involved transracial placements, where prospective parents were people of color attempting to adopt white children. In stark contrast, she'd approved 94% of cases involving white parents adopting children of color. The statistical disparity was so extreme, it could only be explained by systematic racial bias operating throughout her entire career. But the numbers alone didn't capture the human cost. Federal investigators began interviewing families Patricia had denied over the years. The stories were heartbreaking and eerily similar to David's experience. Marcus Thompson had tried to adopt his white foster daughter Emma 8 years earlier. Emma had been with him for 3 years, longer than she'd lived with anyone else in her young life. She called him Daddy. Her trauma symptoms had resolved completely. She was thriving in school and therapy. Patricia had recommended denial based on concerns about cultural disconnection and racial identity confusion. She told me almost the exact same things she told you, Judge Hayes, Marcus said during his interview, tears streaming down his face. That I couldn't give Emma what she needed because I was black and she was white. That Emma deserved to grow up understanding her white heritage. That placing her with me would be doing her a disservice. Marcus's voice broke. Emma spent 3 more years bouncing between foster homes after Patricia denied us. She aged out of the system at 18 without ever finding permanency. She's 22 now and struggles with addiction and homelessness. We tried reconnecting a few years ago, but the damage was done. The system destroyed our bond during those crucial years when she needed stability most. That social worker stole my daughter from me and got away with it until you came along with the power to expose her. Another case involved 2 mothers, Jennifer and Sarah Chen Rodriguez, who'd fostered twin boys named Carlos and Diego for 5 years. The twins had come to them at age 2 after severe neglect by their biological parents. By age 7, they were healthy, happy, attached, thriving. Patricia had recommended denial because same-sex couples couldn't provide appropriate male role models, and adding racial differences to the equation would create too much confusion for the children's identity development. The twins, who'd called these women Mom and Mama since they could talk, were separated and placed in different foster homes. Officials decided it would be easier to find individual placements than keep them together. Carlos attempted suicide at 16 after years of unstable placements and feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. He survived but struggled with severe depression. Diego fell into addiction in his late teens and experienced homelessness throughout his early 20s, unable to maintain stable housing or relationships. Jennifer and Sarah had tried for years to maintain contact with the boys, but the system made it nearly impossible. By the time the twins were adults, the damage was irreversible. Those boys had a family, Jennifer told investigators, her voice hollow. They had stability and love and everything children need to heal from trauma. Patricia Morrison ripped that away from them because she didn't approve of how our family looked. And the system backed her up, protected her, allowed her to keep doing it to other families. Pattern after pattern emerged. Story after story of lives destroyed by one person's unchecked prejudice disguised as professional judgment. A Hispanic couple denied from adopting a white sibling group they'd fostered for 2 years. The children were separated and placed individually. One developed severe behavioral problems. Another ran away repeatedly from foster placements. A black grandmother denied from adopting her white biological grandson after her daughter died. The boy was placed with strangers instead of the woman who'd been caring for him since birth. He bounced through 7 placements in 3 years before finally reuniting with his grandmother when he aged out at 18. But their relationship was irreparably damaged. An Asian father denied from adopting his white foster son despite 3 years of successful placement. The boy was moved to a white foster family that later returned him to the system after 6 months because they couldn't handle his behavioral issues that hadn't existed in his previous placement. Each story represented real lives, real trauma, real damage that could never be fully repaired. David compiled everything into a comprehensive federal report. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia Morrison had operated with systematic racial bias for 15 years, destroying families and damaging children, protected by a system that treated her professional judgment as unquestionable. The report went to the State Licensing Board, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and every family court judge in the jurisdiction. Patricia Morrison was permanently stripped of her social work license. But David knew that wasn't enough. One bad social worker losing her license didn't fix the systemic problems that had allowed her to operate unchecked for so long. The real problem was a child welfare system that dismissed complaints, ignored patterns, and protected workers from accountability while families suffered. David testified before the state legislature about the need for comprehensive reform. His testimony was broadcast on local news and went viral online, viewed by millions of people across the country. "I'm standing here today not because I'm special or unique," David told the packed legislative chamber, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience and professional authority. "I'm here because I happen to have judicial credentials that I could weaponize against discrimination. But what about everyone else? What about families who don't have judges or lawyers or anyone with institutional power to protect them?" He paused, looking directly at the committee members. They suffer in silence. Their children stay in foster care indefinitely, aging out of the system without ever finding permanency. Their families never form. Their bonds are destroyed by bureaucrats who think their personal comfort with how families look is more important than children's welfare. And the system continues operating exactly as it always has, protecting workers like Patricia Morrison while destroying innocent families who have the audacity to look different from what someone thinks families should look like. David's voice grew stronger. Reforming this system isn't about lowering standards or being soft on child protection. This is about enforcing laws that already exist, federal laws that explicitly prohibit racial discrimination in adoption decisions. Laws that require evidence-based practice instead of gut feelings and personal biases. Laws that demand accountability when constitutional rights are violated. The legislature passed sweeping reforms 3 months later. The new laws required automatic state-level review of any adoption denial involving transracial placements. Required detailed written justification with actual evidence for all denials, not just vague concerns about cultural identity. Established independent oversight committees with authority to reverse discriminatory decisions. Most importantly, the reforms created civil remedies, allowing families to sue social workers personally for violations of federal adoption law, and mandated comprehensive racial bias training for all social workers with annual recertification requirements. The laws also established anonymous reporting systems for families experiencing discrimination with strong protections against retaliation. David knew these reforms wouldn't fix everything overnight. Systemic racism built over decades doesn't disappear because you pass a few laws, but it was a beginning, a foundation for change. 5 years after that morning in Patricia Morrison's office, Judge David Hayes had fundamentally changed how family courts handled transracial adoption cases. His rulings were regularly cited in appellate decisions across multiple jurisdictions. His written judicial opinions on adoption discrimination were studied in law school courses nationwide. His advocacy had directly protected hundreds of families. And Michael, now 12 years old, straight-A student, robotics club champion, still passionate about paleontology, sometimes sat in the courtroom gallery during adoption hearings, watching his dad work. One afternoon, after a particularly contentious hearing where David had overruled an especially egregious, racially motivated denial, Michael asked a question that showed how deeply he'd been thinking about these issues. "Does it bother you that you had to be a judge to adopt me?" Michael asked as they walked to the parking lot. "That regular people going through what you went through don't have that kind of protection? Doesn't that make you angry about how unfair the system is?" David stopped walking and looked at his son. This thoughtful, empathetic kid who was growing into an impressive young man. "Yeah," David said honestly. "It bothers me every single day. It's not fair that power and credentials mattered more than justice and evidence. That I was able to protect our family because I happened to have judicial authority while other families facing identical discrimination get destroyed. That inequality is exactly why I do what I do now in court. I can't change that power protected us when basic human decency should have been enough, but I can use that power now to protect everyone else." Michael nodded slowly. "Do you think that social worker actually changed, like learned something about her own prejudices? Or did she just learn to hide them better?" "Honestly, don't know, buddy," David admitted. "I heard she left child welfare entirely and moved to a different state. Maybe the experience taught her something meaningful about examining her own biases. Maybe she just found a different field where those biases wouldn't be challenged as directly. Either way, she's not in a position to hurt families anymore. That's what matters most." "Would you do it again?" Michael asked. "Go through the system as a regular person if you could go back, knowing you might face that discrimination?" David thought for a long time before answering. "No. If I had it to do over with the knowledge I have now, I'd probably disclose my position from the start to protect us both from that trauma. That experience of facing that discrimination was genuinely one of the most terrifying moments of my life, but I don't regret how it happened because it taught me something critically important about how most families experience this system. That lesson, as painful as it was, has shaped everything I've done since." 10 years after that, life-changing morning, Judge David Hayes was still on his mission, still protecting transracial families from discrimination, still calling out coded racist language when he saw it in case reports, still overruling biased social worker recommendations, still teaching other judges and social workers how to recognize prejudice disguised as professional concern. A young black woman named Keisha stood before his bench, trying to adopt her elderly white foster mother's biological grandson after the grandmother died. The social worker had denied the placement based on concerns about racial socialization and cultural disconnection. "Let me be absolutely clear," David said, his voice carrying judicial authority that brooked no argument. "This child lost his grandmother, the person who raised him. He is now being cared for by someone who loved his grandmother deeply and is committed to honoring her memory by raising her grandson. This is exactly the kind of kinship placement we should support and protect. The fact that Ms. Johnson is black and the child is white is completely irrelevant to this determination. This child is safe, loved, and connected to his family history through this placement. That matters infinitely more than whether everyone in family photographs has matching skin tones." Adoption granted effective immediately. After the hearing, Keisha approached with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Your Honor. My foster mom made me promise to take care of her grandson before she died. The social worker kept saying I wasn't appropriate because of race. Thank you for letting me keep my promise to her." David looked at this young woman who'd just been given the chance to honor a dying woman's last wish. You kept your promise. Now go home and take care of your son. But David knew protecting individual families wasn't enough. He needed to create lasting systemic change. Working with civil rights organizations, he helped establish a national database tracking adoption denials involving transracial placements. The database revealed patterns across multiple states: social workers who consistently denied transracial adoptions, jurisdictions with disparate denial rates, regions where discrimination was particularly prevalent. The data became a powerful tool for advocacy and reform. Other states began adopting similar legislation to what David's testimony had inspired in his own state. Federal agencies started investigating jurisdictions with the most egregious patterns. David also partnered with law schools to create specialized training for judges and attorneys on recognizing and combating discrimination in adoption proceedings. His case became a central teaching tool, an example of how bias operates even in systems designed to protect children. 15 years after sitting in Patricia Morrison's office, David attended a national conference on adoption and child welfare. He'd been invited to give the keynote address about his experience and the reforms that followed. The ballroom was packed with social workers, judges, attorneys, child welfare administrators, people who made decisions affecting families every single day. David stood at the podium and told his story: the discrimination he'd faced, Patricia Morrison's casual cruelty, the terror of almost losing Michael, the revelation of his judicial identity, the investigation that followed, the hundreds of families whose stories had been uncovered. "I want to be clear about something," David said, his voice filling the large room. "I didn't experience anything unique. The only unique thing about my story is that I had the power to fight back. But the discrimination I faced, that happens every single day in offices across this country. The only difference is that most families don't have judicial credentials to weaponize against it." He paused, scanning the audience. "Some of you in this room have made decisions based on how families look, rather than how families function. Some of you have dismissed complaints because they were uncomfortable to address. Some of you have protected colleagues whose bias was destroying lives. And some of you have been the families suffering that discrimination, lacking the power or platform to be heard." The room was completely silent. The question isn't whether bias exists in our system. The evidence is overwhelming that it does. The question is what we're going to do about it. Are we going to keep protecting workers whose prejudices masquerade as professional judgment? Or are we going to enforce the laws that already exist to protect families from discrimination? David's voice grew stronger. "Because here's what I learned from my experience. Accountability changes behavior. When Patricia Morrison thought she could discriminate with impunity, she destroyed hundreds of families over 15 years. The moment she realized there would be consequences, she approved my adoption within hours. That's not a story about redemption or learning. That's a story about power and accountability." He leaned forward slightly. "We need systems where accountability doesn't require judicial credentials, where every family gets the protection I was able to claim, where discrimination has consequences regardless of who it targets. That's the standard we should be working toward. Not perfect justice, that might be impossible, but consistent accountability. That's achievable if we have the will to make it happen." The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. After his speech, dozens of people approached David. Social workers who wanted to do better, judges who'd never considered how their rulings might reflect bias, attorneys who represented families facing discrimination, and families themselves, people, who'd experienced exactly what David had described, who'd lost children or struggled for years against a system that judged them on appearance rather than love. One elderly black man waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Judge Hayes, I tried to adopt my grandson 30 years ago after my daughter died. White child, black grandfather. The system denied me, said he needed to be raised by someone who looked like him. He ended up in 7 different foster homes. We never got to rebuild our relationship before he died of an overdose at 26. The man's eyes were filled with tears. And something else. Validation. "Thank you for telling your story. for making people understand what that discrimination costs. My grandson's gone, but maybe your work will save someone else's family. Maybe other grandfathers won't lose their grandchildren to a system that thinks skin color matters more than blood and love. 20 years after that morning in Patricia Morrison's office, Judge David Hayes looked at the photograph on his chamber's wall. Michael, at age 7, holding that purple crayon stick figure drawing on adoption finalization day. Both of them smiling like their whole world had just come together. Because it had. Michael was now 27, married, working as a paleontologist at a major research university, expecting his first child. David's grandchild would be mixed race, part black, part white, part Asian from Michael's wife's heritage. A beautiful combination that some social worker somewhere might one day question. But because of the work David had done, because of the reforms he'd fought for, because of the precedents he'd set, that grandchild would grow up in a system with more accountability and less tolerance for discrimination than the one David had faced. Not a perfect system. Not yet. Maybe never. But a better one. A system moving slowly toward justice. Patricia Morrison's attempt to destroy David's family based on racial bias had backfired spectacularly. She'd tried to use bureaucratic power against someone she assumed was powerless. Instead, she'd awakened a judge's determination to ensure no other family suffered what his almost suffered. The irony was profound and fitting. The woman who'd built a career on judging families by their appearance had been judged herself, not by how she looked, but by what she'd done. Evaluated based on evidence, held accountable for harm, stripped of power to hurt others. And the man she'd tried to dismiss as unfit had spent 20 years using his authority to protect the families she would have destroyed. That wasn't perfect justice. Perfect justice would be a system where power didn't matter, where every family was evaluated fairly regardless of credentials or connections, but it was accountability, consequence. One person using position and privilege to enforce laws that too often go unenforced. And for hundreds of families David had protected over 2 decades, for children who got to stay with parents who loved them, for people who didn't have to experience the terror and helplessness he'd experienced. That mattered. That was real. That changed lives. A social worker tried to deny a black father adoption rights because she thought white children belonged with white families. She didn't know he was a judge, didn't know her discrimination was being witnessed by someone with power to expose her entire career of bias, didn't know that trying to destroy his family would ultimately cost her everything while saving his. And when David revealed who he was, Patricia Morrison cried. Because for the first time in 15 years, discrimination had consequences instead of just destroying another family. The adoption was approved that very day. Michael and David's family stayed together, and the judge who'd experienced that bias personally returned to his bench with a mission that would define the rest of his career: protect every family from social workers who think love requires matching skin tones. 20 years later, Judge David Hayes is still on that mission. Still shutting down discrimination disguised as professional judgment. Still protecting transracial families who deserve the same chance his family got. Still using the power that saved him to save everyone else who comes through his courtroom doors. Because he remembers sitting in Patricia Morrison's office. Remembers her casual cruelty delivered in bureaucratic language. Remembers her desperate tears when she realized who she'd targeted. Remembers that without his credentials, Michael would have been ripped from his home based purely on skin color. And he's determined to ensure that in his courtroom at least, no family ever faces that kind of discrimination alone and unprotected. The families he protects don't always know they're being saved by someone who almost lost his own son. They just know that Judge Hayes is fair, that he actually enforces laws prohibiting racial discrimination, that he believes families are defined by love, not by matching skin tones in photographs. And that's enough. That has to be enough, because David can't fix the entire system, can't stop every prejudiced social worker, can't personally protect every family facing discrimination, but he can protect the ones who come through his courtroom, can create legal precedent that helps families in other jurisdictions, can teach other judges to recognize coded racism, can train social workers to focus on evidence rather than bias, can testify before legislatures about needed reforms, can use his platform to speak for families who have no voice. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that's enough to make a real difference. A social worker tried to deny a black father adoption rights based on nothing but racial prejudice. She cried when he revealed he was a judge with power to hold her accountable, and she spent the rest of her career watching him use that judicial authority to protect every family she would have destroyed if she'd remained in her position of power. That's not perfect justice. Perfect justice would be a system where credentials don't matter, where every family gets evaluated fairly regardless of institutional authority. But it's accountability, consequence. One judge using his position to enforce laws that are supposed to protect families but too often fail them. And for the hundreds of families Judge David Hayes has protected over 20 years, for the children who got to stay with parents who loved them, for the people who didn't have to experience the terror he experienced in that small government office. That matters. That's real. That changes lives. Not everything. Not nearly enough. But something meaningful and lasting. And David keeps fighting, keeps protecting, keeps using whatever power he has for people who don't have it. Because he remembers, and he'll never forget. Have you ever witnessed justice this personal and this powerful? A social worker tried to destroy a family based on pure racism and discovered she'd targeted someone who could expose her entire career of discrimination. This story goes beyond one case. It reveals how bias operates in systems designed to protect children, how unchecked prejudice destroys countless lives, and how one person's courage can create systemic change that protects hundreds of families. If you believe families should be judged on love rather than skin color, if you think this judge used his power exactly right, if you want to see more stories about accountability and justice prevailing against discrimination, subscribe right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up to injustice can actually work. Drop a comment about your thoughts on adoption, racial bias in systems that claim to protect children, and using privilege and power to protect people who lack both. These stories happen every day across America, and they need to be told, witnessed, and shared. Your engagement helps expose injustice and spread the message that accountability and change are possible when people refuse to stay silent. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video with your community. Leave your thoughts below about how we can build systems that actually protect all families equally. Because your voice matters in the fight for fairness in every courtroom, every government office, every system where power decides who gets justice and who gets destroyed. Subscribe now and join our community demanding better from institutions that control vulnerable families' futures. Let's keep exposing discrimination together and insisting on accountability for people who abuse their authority to hurt others.